Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good to have you all back with us again today for session 2 of 3 of our BPIR Ready seminar series. Remember, the focus and objective of this seminar is threefold. We want to outline the key requirements of the new BPIR regulations. We also want to invite the team from MB to come in and provide some more detail or answer any particular questions that can help us fulfill these requirements. And thirdly, we want to introduce our software, BPIR Ready, to those of you who are looking for assistance with help with putting your disclosure documents together. Many of you may well be familiar with compliance documentation, whether you've gone through the code mark or brands appraisal process or dealt with other third-party engineers. But from our experience, we know there's a number of suppliers who have had little experience with compliance documentation. And so the focus of our software is really to help provide tips and guidance for you to be able to put together your own documents. The goal with BPIR Ready, the software, is not to help you complete a finished document, but for you to actually create a draft document that you would then download and complete. Remember, your disclosure document is a first-party statement. It needs to be authorized and published by yourself. With that in mind, the guidance that we're giving today and through the software is focused around best practice. And I think as suppliers, we need to remember there are 3 key areas we need to be mindful of. One, what is our obligations under Section 14G of the Building Code? Secondly, we do have to provide an overview of requirements under the BPIR legislation, which we'll get into today. And thirdly, we want to make sure that when architects and builders particularly are looking at our information, consumers as well, that they have the confidence and reassurance from our documentation to increase selection and specification of our products. All right, we've had lots of feedback during and after last week's session. We've had hundreds of you who have been in and used the software. And thanks for those of you who provided feedback, many of which we have been implementing over the last week. And also, with your reminder for today's session yesterday, we also had a link for you to provide some feedback to MB. MB are coming back next week to look at a number of details. They want to provide some information around contact information, particularly for those of you who are importing products or components, but also reiterating other things like warnings and bans and warranty information. So Nancy, if you don't mind just putting a link into the chat for those of you who have not completed that feedback form and would like to give information directly to MB. If you could fill out that over the next couple of days, we will make sure the team receive that in advance for our session next Tuesday. All right, with that in mind, we can kick off today's session. So I'll just start by sharing my screen. If I could just hear a thumbs up to make sure that you're seeing everything you should be seeing. Thank you very much, Dom Hay. All right. Okay, in terms of, we're going to go through a quick review of last week's session, and then we are going to continue with the development of your BPIR disclosure document. In fact, today we're going to just provide a quick overview of the technical performance summary. John Gardiner is going to help us do that. And then we're going to bring John Allen back to have a look at how we can use the BPIR Ready tool to help us do that. So particularly, we're going to be looking at how we want to relate to performance with the building code, how we develop our scope of use, and also whether we should be identifying any limitations or conditions of use, and how we reference documents, particularly in providing evidence to those performance requirements. All right, in terms of what we learned last week, the deadline for the BPIR disclosure documents is the 11th of December. That's not going to change. So that's the date we need to work towards. I know many merchants have requested information earlier than that, so they can test their own systems. I think the earliest I've seen is late August. So please make sure that you are in communication with your merchant, understand what requirements they might have. We also learned that under the regulations, the documents that you provide, your disclosure documents, it's not prescribed what they're called or the structure. So the guidance will actually help us with setting what needs to be in those documents, but you do not need to call it a BPIR. In fact, you may well have documents that already exist that meet these requirements. So name nor structure is not specified. You need to determine where your source of truth is going to be held. So what we found out is that majority of merchants will be linking through to your website. And so whether documents going to sit there or in another repository like EBOSS, you need to determine where that source of truth will actually be located. And that'll enable you to be able to provide links to other platforms and retailers to be able to find that information. Lots of feedback around the level of detail we have to go into around our supply chain, particularly if we're importing manufactured goods from overseas. So MB are going to finish, we'll address this next week, but again, any particular questions on that, please send them through. We also had lots of feedback around, hey, is my product actually included or excluded from the BPIR requirements? The advice from MB was please get in contact with them. Here's the email address, and they will provide, hopefully, further information to assist you there. And finally, John Allen took us through getting into our software, and a little bit of prep for today's session was for you to familiarize yourself with that and to start a disclosure statement. And with that in mind, you should have at least drafted the product description, the class 1 or class 2, and determined the category and any additional use clauses that you that were identified as part of the process in the software. All right, today we're going to have a look at the summarizing the performance requirements of your products. And we're very fortunate to have John Gardiner here to take us through this session. Now, I introduced John briefly last week. He's the ex-determinations manager at Department of Building and Housing and MB. There's very few people in the industry who have more experience in interpreting how to apply the building code to the performance of building products. So, John, we really appreciate your time and expertise here today. John, I will run your presentation off my screen, and looking forward to hearing your presentation. And just a reminder that we do have the chat function open. So I see a number of you have put questions in there, but please send them through, and we'll try to address those the appropriate time. So John, over to you.
All right, thanks, Matt, and good afternoon, everybody. So as Matt indicated, I'm just going to talk you through some of the way that we've developed the BPIR, taking into account how you then develop compliance information for building products. So I sort of first start off with just talking a wee bit about the code itself. I know it sort of frightens you a wee bit, sort of about sort of it can be a little bit sort of impenetrable, but the BPIR so we start out. BPIR requires a summary of where the product can be used, the limitations of use, and the supporting evidence of the compliance information. So that's a big picture of what you're trying to do with the stuff. So what? Sorry, my screen's generating a bit slow. So I'll go through the building code and building products, just a quick overview of what is a rather large area, talk about sort of the principles behind establishing the scope and conditions of use for your compliance claims, understanding how the evidence of compliance can be structured, etc., and some of the basic things around that, and then also about some best practice about documentation supporting claims. So thank you for that. Right. So one of the good things we have in New Zealand is that we have a performance-based building code. You know, it describes outcomes required from buildings and not the inputs and processes into building buildings, as it were. And it's effectively the performance standards for which building work is evaluated, like when you apply for consent, etc. Except in a very few circumstances, it does not directly regulate building products. And the good example of where the one exception to that is around hazardous building materials, where there's a clear obligation about building materials and being hazardous, and that's neutral as respect to whether the materials are used on a high-rise building or a small outbuilding on the thing. So that's the only code clause generally where it's not building work specific. So what that does mean in terms of making compliance claims is that you've got to provide the context for the type of building work for which your compliance claims are sort of being made. You know, so the example there about, so for a floor system where there are in some instances obligations around slip resistance and being easily cleaned and impervious, you need to then sort of describe that in terms of those particular conditions as part of your compliance claims. And because in some cases you can, if you're not able to support your evidence, you might want to then scope that out. One of the other challenges we've got around the building code, and again, it sort of comes from partially the performance-based aspect, is that most of the performance we've got is expressed in qualitative terms, not quantitative terms. So it uses things like adequate and sufficient. There are the older code clauses where there are some specific measurable numbers used, but they tend to be relatively rare. And so the way we deal with that is that sometimes we have to look to acceptable solutions and verification methods and their reference standards to get a handle on what performance looks like and some measurable criteria. That's not to say that products have to comply with those reference standards or acceptable solutions, but we do have to look towards them to get a sense for what compliance looks like. So, thank you, Matt. So one of the criteria under the BPIR is around sort of providing the evidence to support your claims. This is where I suspect some of you are going to sort of have some difficulty a wee bit around that. What we have done in the BPIR tool, we've gone through and provided some general 101 level sort of suggested compliance pathways for various code clauses. Hopefully over time we'll add to that, but there is a bit of a start point for some of you who've not had to do this before, where you can start your thinking, and that's sort of within the BPIR tool. In general, the evidence base that you do provide needs to be referenced against each objective clause, e.g. B1 structure, E2 external moisture, etc. So that's the way it's normally done, and that it's useful, and it provides you with a bit of clarity about thinking about how you present it as well. So in most cases, the evidence is going to be sort of coming from either direct compliance with an acceptable solution in any reference standards, could be testing using a verification method, could be a professional opinion provided by somebody who's, particularly if you've got sort of a product which is outside the scope of the acceptable solutions, etc. Or it could be international standards or other compliance information that you've got for a product, particularly if it's imported. You know, the ICC evaluation service, the British Border Agreement, many products have got some form of credentialing from them. And so what you then probably just need to do is then, if they're appropriate evidence-based, just draw a correlation between the relevance of that particular compliance information to the New Zealand Building Code. So that's generally, that's covering off at a top level the sort of way of providing the evidence to support the compliance claims. Thank you, Matt. Is it generating.
Sorry, John, I left off that last point for you. I don't know if you wanted to address that.
Oh, sorry. Yes, yes, a very important point. Yes, and of course, one thing you need to be very conscious of is getting a line of sight between your evidence to support the compliance and your product. This may sound a little bit sort of silly, but particularly if you've got an imported product, there may be you may have a test report or some other evidence base from Europe or wherever, but it describes the product slightly differently. You've got a new name for that product in New Zealand, for instance. So you do need to be able to show a bit of a line of sight between the product that you're providing the BPIR for and the test or supporting evidence that you've got. So just, it's quite surprising sometimes how stuff crops up, but you can't make that sort of correlation between the product that you're seeing and the evidence base.
John, just so I can recap for everyone. So what I've done there is provide an overview of how the code is structured. And so as a supplier, we obviously have to, I have to determine whether or not my product actually has requirements of performance under the building code. The BPIR documentation says if the performance of your product does contribute to the building code requirements of the building, then a BPIR disclosure document is required.
Yes,
So,
yes, correct. And so that's what the tool does for that category. It sets up what we believe is the relevant code clauses for your particular category.
yes. So I need to be quite clear as a manufacturer that if those code requirements if there are code requirements, and if so, need to understand what those clauses are in the building code. And then your points here is I need to justify how the product can demonstrate that it meets those minimum requirements from the building code.
Yes, and as we'll go into the next section, within the context of the building work that you're proposing to claim compliance with.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Let's continue on.
Right. Thanks, Matt. So as alluded to before, and about sort of providing that scope of the building work for which the compliance claims you want to make. So this is really what occurs in your scope of use. And so this is here where you're going through and identifying, well, I've got this particular product. Looks like I have to comply with these particular code clauses. I just need to then sort of start shaping that and framing it for those compliance claims you're about to be made to be valid. And there's a number of different things, ways that this can be done, and it does vary from category to category. There's no right answer or wrong answer that covers the whole range. I think it's fair to say that there are some building products out there which what I call compliance rich or compliance complex. Some cladding products where there's lots of considerations, whereas there are some products such as an ordinary tap. Most ordinary taps can be used anywhere, whether it be residential, commercial, whatever type situation. So you've got this whole spectrum of how you need to think about it depending upon your product. So developing your scope of use, some of the things which can be quite critical there, again, depending upon the type of product you've got. So the part of building where you're proposing it to be used, external wall, roof, floor and internal walls. That may sound a bit obvious, but it's sometimes a little bit unclear if you look at the compliance information for a product about this cladding. Is it only for the wall, or can it be used for roof as well? Sometimes you need to think about the building type, residential, commercial. There are clause A1 of the building code sets up some things called classified uses, which puts buildings into particular categories. And that's used in some cases to derive the code obligations. Some code obligations only apply to certain classified use buildings. In many cases, you also might want to then limit the performance requirements of the building to which you are wanting to make your claims. Some other attributes, its structure, you might claim to 3604 or claddings to a particular type if you are, say, selling providing evidence for, say, an underlay, for instance. The big one is often around then specifying the building location about with compliance claims. Wind zones and seismic zones are quite important drivers of structural aspects to building code compliance. So, some things, particularly if we're getting up to some of the very high wind zone type areas in New Zealand, windows, etc., sometimes you might have to limit your compliance information to certain wind zones because you haven't got the evidence to support wind at the very high levels that we do experience, particularly here in Wellington. Exposure zones being another one, more related to durability, about close to coastal areas, etc. So working through the scope of use can be quite an important sort of framework that you need to sort of work through. Also, one advice I've got is if you look at some of the established compliance information out there, say through code mark certificates or brands appraisals, they're often got a very narrow scope. Particularly if they're using things like 3604 E2AS1, they don't really cover some of the sort of the medium density type buildings. So describing a scope, there is some quite important sort of commercial decisions there. You need to match up also with the availability of evidence to support your claims. Thanks, Matt. Right, now the next thing to think about is if you want to impose any conditions and limitations of use. I talked in the previous slide about scope of use. There is a bit of a grey line between something that can be a scope of use or conditions and limitations of use. These things are not totally binary. So some of these things, particularly my first dot point, could actually be within the scope of use. This is just a tool to help you think way through. So some of the conditions and limitations of use, often in the areas is around just making sure that, making available design or installation manuals or criteria that you put in place to say, well, I'm saying my product complies with these code clauses within the scope, but also it's important that people follow the instructions that set out for how you design or install the product. So that's an example of a common condition limitations of use. Some people impose competency requirements on designers or installers. They may have a registered installer scheme or similar, or they have some form of partnership arrangement where people meeting certain criteria. I think that can be quite good, but you also don't want to create additional complexity. That sort of registered installer type framework really is only appropriate in my mind where you've got a product which is quite complex to install. And you don't want to be totally reliant upon somebody not able to follow manuals or instructions, etc. And there may be some other limits you might want to make. So, for example, I think we're missing a point there, Matt. Right. So you may say an example of a floor material supplier. Your compliance claims may be sort of valid for a particular full range of use, but because you might have something which it still complies with, say, durability, but you might think, it's due to the type of duty cycle is not quite suitable for use. And the example I give here in, say, a retail facility, where you might want to say, well, we're going to propose a limitation. This can only be used in a residential floor system. You may have a commercial product available, which probably is very similar in terms of the code obligations and even the evidence base, but it's more robust for that type of use. So here's your opportunity to fine tune about some of your compliance claims. Right, so let's just move on now to just some of the good practice information around referencing the technical documentation. So, there is the scope within the BPIR requirements. They sort of allude to sort of referencing supporting information. Some of the stuff could be, the design and installation manuals I've talked about before, your compliance evidence that you're wanting to make available. So that's the sort of information we're talking about here. I think good practice is to provide a direct link, the URL, to where you can actually find the documentation. I know that's not a literal, not a requirement of the BPIR. The BPIR generally, you only need to go to the URL to the website itself rather than further in. I think it's also useful to be able to provide a little bit more detail there, particularly if you've got a website where there's quite a complex range of information there, and so people don't have to thrash around for doing that. Getting there, I think formatting in PDF or some other equivalents. I know there are some other stuff out there. Just with the benefit you have there, the clear benefit is that it's not as easily manipulatable. I know there is quite a fairly significant building product supplier in New Zealand whose best practice in many things, but one area where their current information is they provide it in Word. Why would you provide something in information which can be easily manipulated? So putting it in that particular format. Also, just want to acknowledge those people out there who are really being innovative about providing some of the technical information using videos and other sort of interactive tools that are available with the iPads and whatever. So we're starting to see some really good, exciting stuff out there about how you help people use your products. And then the point also I'd like to make is around versioning of documents. Life is never static. Things always change. You spot typos, there are new requirements. Really, please, make sure you put in place some versioning so that people can recognize the version of the document they've got in front of them. Is it the current one or a previous one? And have that versioning referencing on the front page. I also think another good thing that improves usability is having a simple table. Version 2 said that, had this, version 3 we also added details to table 23 or whatever. So a person who is familiar with the different versions can actually see what the differences are between the versions. It just helps that usability. And the final point around the technical documentation I want to make is try and be consistent. It's quite common where product suppliers have got information to support the same product. Would be safety data sheet, it could be PTS, it could be design installation manuals, and now BPIR type stuff where you spot differences in some of the keys between those documents, slightly different wordings around descriptions, scopes of use, etc. There's nothing quicker that's designed to get people suspicious about things if you've got those clear inconsistencies. So before you publish, I think one of the key things you should be doing is going through and making sure that all your documents that relate to a particular product are consistent. And all those key attributes are using the same structure and framework. So on that, I'll then hand you back to Matt, who will then introduce the next section.
Yeah, thanks, John. Hey, look, I just want to cover a couple of things that you pointed out. One around links to documentation. So what MB explained to us in a session we did with merchants a few weeks ago is that it's fine for a merchant to be able to link from their in-store through QR codes or their online system to your website. So they don't actually need a specific link to the documentation. Going to your website is fine, but there is an expectation on your website that the documents will be easily found. So if you had a tile or a menu on your homepage, they would see that navigation would be sufficient in terms of providing that customer experience to be able to find that information quickly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I suppose my observation I make is that everybody's going to have to do this, and so a point of differentiation that some people might want to make is make it as easy as possible for people to access the information. Sort of present it, not bury it.
Yep, great. And then back to scope and limitations of use. We had Emmy last week giving some advice around how we can actually group products together. So we can have one disclosure document which might actually cover off a range or a family of products. And so again, that's really helpful to think about how we actually group products together that have these same performance requirements and scope and limitations of use. So John, if I'm thinking about standard residential tapware range that might be in different colors or different sizes, or maybe some internal door handles, so hardware that again could be in different sizes or colors, we can actually group them together within the same disclosure document because they have the same requirements and scope of use.
Yes, correct. Yes, I think there's the thing to sort of build together families. I think the main boundary you might want to think about, if you have, say, some products which have slightly different, same sort of product, but a slightly different building code obligation, that's where you might want to think about having to create another family. But then equally, say if you have, using the example, door handles and taps, if you have within a particular range of taps a versioning that also has got the long arms for use for people with disabilities, slightly different code obligations, but I still think that you could then present that in the one document. That's my own personal view.
Yes. Great, thanks, John. Hey, and appreciate all the questions coming through. We'll have time to manage those at the end, but what I'd like to do now is get John Allen back to just show us how we can now start to look at the BPIR Ready tool to actually help us identify these code clauses and start to develop our own scope and limitations of use and how we can link to documentation as well. John, great to have you here again. Over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, so last week I took you through an intro to our BPIR Ready software, and we worked on an example of a wall cladding product called Hercules Cedar Board. And if we look at the required disclosure information from MB, what we covered last week was the clear naming of the product and writing the description. And today I'm gonna pick it up from here and cover these sections that John Gardiner has just referenced before. So I'm going to go to my BPIR summaries where I've got a few loaded up, and I'm actually going to start a bit differently this time and going to show you a completed summary. So you can just see what we're working towards. So I have my Hercules Cedar Board wall cladding product here, all finished. And you would have heard last week that there is no set layout. And Matt mentioned just before, actually, for that disclosure information under BPIR. But the way that we think of it is telling a story that goes, this is my product. This is how it is expected to contribute to compliance with the building code when used with the following scope of use and conditions of use and supporting documentation. Just coming back up to the building code, relevant building code clauses here. You can actually see there's a number of clauses referenced on this particular summary for my wall cladding product. And for those of you who are less familiar with the code, your final summary, just want to point out, has an appendix at the very bottom where we outline all of those full descriptions from those performance clauses. So I may not know what C3.7 is as an example. When I'm get here, I can just go and read this and I get the full description from the performance clause there. So look, today we're going to sort of reverse engineer this, cover those steps in the tool, and then jump back to, actually no, before I do that, I did want to Just point a couple of things out. We had some great feedback last week, so appreciate everyone who got in touch there. A few of you did mention you got to the end of the tool and you'd like a few more pathways to edit one that you finished. So just want to let you know we've added a little edit button at the final view step of the summary. You can click that. That's going to take you to your last sort of step you're up to on the review for me here. And also within these review sections, sorry, we've got these edit buttons, so you can jump directly to a previous step if you want to edit something. We've also hyperlinked these steps that you've already completed over on the left here. You can see the hover when I go over. So you've got a few different ways now to jump around instead of just using these buttons, the previous and next buttons at the end of each step. So I'm going to go to my other one, which is 33% completed. I'm going to hit edit and pick up where we left off last time. So I'm on the building code performance step now. And this has matched relevant code clauses based on my category or cladding and my responses to the additional use questions I was asked. So just a refresher, I'll click view selections here, and it just shows me I answered yes to those two questions there. So we've got our matching clauses. Now, we've attempted to match those based on shared code obligations for the type of product that I've selected here. Put quite a bit of work into that, but ultimately this is your disclosure information, and in your final published version, just want to say that you'll need to have decided on which clauses you feel comfortable with. We've provided those descriptions of the performance clauses again here when you expand this accordion menu. So you can learn a bit more about them within this step as well. Look, if you don't have a good understanding of these, we do recommend researching further, and you can also contact a third-party consultant, which you'll find some of those listed on the BPIR.nz website. One last thing for those of you who'd like to edit these clauses, you're going to find that you can't do that within BPIR Ready. But of course, once you've finished your summary, you can copy it, download that final text, and you can edit it as you wish. Remove, add, whatever you want to do. If you think something's missing, that's a common clause, we encourage you to get in touch, and we will always review. And if it's a common additional use in our terminology, we might add that. Now, moving on, the written component to this step is outlining how my product is expected to contribute to compliance with these relevant clauses. And if I just scroll down a little bit here, quite a bit of info here, but we have laid out for you a bunch of possible compliance pathways at the clause objective level. So it's not going to cover everything specifically to your performance clauses, but it's going to give you a bit more insight into writing those. And John's already covered a lot of these ways that you demonstrate compliance. So I won't go through all of that right now. But if I come down to the bottom, you can see I've got my input text editor again, and I could view an example if I wanted to, which is a miscellaneous product, just so you can see how that could be written. And for now, I'm going to put in my pre-prepared contribution to compliance. So I've covered how it contributes there, and moving on to the next step, which is the scope of use. So you might recognize this the sort of layout on this step, which is very similar to the description step we did last week. So again, we have some information just about what a scope of use is from the perspective of BPIR, and then we get into some writing tips based on this category that I've selected, wall cladding. In that item column, you might recognize those terms that John referenced earlier, and we've got some specific examples for cladding that often are covered or should be covered in a scope of use. If I scroll down a little bit more, also got some further tips encouraging me to point out a few things in my scope of use based on my additional use question responses. So because I said, yes, this product is suitable for use closer to 1 meter from a relevant boundary, I have to, well, it's recommended, we're recommending that I put that in my scope of use as well. And again, I do have that opportunity to view a written example tailored to my category and my additional use, which we demonstrated on the description step last week. So again, I got a pre-prepared one, which I'll put in here and move on to the next step, which is conditions of use. Very similar in terms of how the tool works to that previous scope of use step. So again, got some guidance tips for writing based on the category of wall cladding that I had selected. John has covered those already. And we don't actually have any additional use triggered writing tips because you don't have to put anything in based on my yes responses. So that's nice, a little less work for me on here, and I will pop in my conditions of use for Hercules, cedar board. Cool, so we're rolling now through the meaty written sections, which is good, and up to the supporting documentation step. So if I've referenced any documents already, especially in that scope of use and conditions of use, that's probably going to happen there. I just want to make sure I'm providing a way for readers of my disclosure information to clearly access that. So this is why we put this step in here. I think the disclosure information required references maintenance and installation specifically. We've added a few other kind of types of documents as prompts and tags down here for you. So in previously, I have mentioned my Hercules design manual, version number 2. So I'm going to pop that in, and that's hosted on my website. I'll put that URL in there too. And that is a design manual. So I'm just going to click that little tag there, and you can actually do more than one. So these are prompts for you, and they also just allow you and users of your information to see what types of documentation that's covering. So in this one, I'm going to say that my installation instructions are also covered in that design manual. I'm also going to add another one, which will make that a warranty. Slightly different versioning structure. Always good to keep them consistent, but just throwing something different in here. And I've got a URL for that too. Point out that it's a warranty. And I'm done with documentation. So that sort of ends what I'll go through today. We're at contact details, and a lot of you have questions about those, especially if you're an importer. That's going to be covered next week. So I'll throw it back to Matt from here. Just get you to unmute.
Thanks very much, John. Hey, just want to cover off a few things before we get to your questions. So in terms of preparation for next week, John has shown us so really a really big meaty part of these disclosure statements. And so our intention is to actually have a draft statement completed by the end of next week. And so with that in mind, we have got a little bit of preparation for you to really look at that scope, limitations of use and performance requirements. Hopefully for many of you, the BPIR Ready tool can help you with that. I see a number of you have mentioned that your categories are not in there. Remember, we mentioned last week, there is an other category for you to be able to still complete a disclosure document, but it won't have the tips or recommended code clauses in there. And also to start linking your documents through to as part of your disclosure document. So that is that's the objective for next Tuesday, where we will be looking at finalising the documents and talking to MB about some of those trickier sections. All right, I just want to jump through to some questions now, and we'll actually go right back. Rudolph, you've got a great question around why wasn't embodied carbon considered as part of the statement? I think that certainly came up in consultation. I certainly talked to MB about it, but wasn't something where they landed. But I would not be surprised if that was to be brought in at a later date, because certainly would be consistent with how we see consenting developing and disclosure requirements for suppliers.
Yes, if I could just add something to that, Matt. Yes, I think I think what the framework at present is around the code obligations as they occur now. I think the way that the climate work program for MB is going is that the building code is going to have some embodied carbon obligations, and then once that comes through into the code, then people will then need to update their BPIR to reflect those new and additional code clauses. So it's coming.
Yes, thanks, Caroline. Last session we advised about the grace period for products on the shelves. What's the advice, please, for products in storage, in transit, etc.? So what we heard from MB is that the BPIR requirements are required for any products which are put on sale on or after the 11th of December. So if you have products in stock or in transit, or if they are stocked before the 11th of December, there is no requirements for those particular items. It's only for products that actually come available for purchase on or after the 11th of December. So I hope that covers your question there. Caroline, if products are not available for sale, e.g. samples, are they covered by the regulations? I would expect not. John, do you have a view on that?
Yes, it's a good question. Although just thinking about what sort of circumstances that would apply, because if you had a sample would be intended to sell. But yes, I don't think if you have got a sample that's not one that's ever likely to be sold, no, I don't think the spirit of the regulation is designed to cover that.
Caroline,
they need to be the wording there is available for wholesale or retail purchase in MB's documentation.
Yep. Thanks, John. Adrian, will BPIR have crossover or replace programs such as Declare? I would not think so, Adrian. I think Declare's got a separate purpose around disclosing the ingredients or inputs into a particular material and its contribution to the environmental performance of a building or outcome. So I don't see any crossover there at all. Provide a link to where the code clauses such as B1 can be found. Mario, I hope you can see that by using the tool that we do have a very quick reference to the specific items that we believe relate to each product category within the tool. If not, I actually see that Rob's put a link into the Building Performance website where you can actually have a look at all code descriptions. So you can look through there.
Yeah, just one point I didn't make, but just something for some people. The building code is actually a regulation, and so therefore, you know, it's available on the free on the regulations government regulations website.
Great, thank you. Ropada, he's talking about consistency here. Why do some councils accept compliance documentation for flooring when others decline it and say to go to MB to get a determination? John, that's a big comment, a big topic, but do you have a succinct summary for Ropada there?
Yeah, it's a big topic, and it's one of the issues that we faced. We're facing every day around that. I think there needs to be some clearer guidance provided by MB to help building consent officials deal with building products. And I think this is going to get slightly worse as the BPIRs come onto stream. I think there's going to be different BCAs taking a different view about the quality of BPIR information. So that's a bit of a negative answer, because I'm effectively saying I think this issue is going to get a bit worse. Yeah,
look, I think MB have an expectation that these regulations are actually going to assist BCAs. So we'd hope that MB have got a thorough education process to try and build some confidence with BCAs that this can in fact assist, particularly in the area of flooring, Ropada. Okay, is a recording of session 1 available? Yes, it should have been. It was in the link for the reminder yesterday, and we'll send it again for reminders for next week's session. And we'll have a recording of today's session up by the close of play today. Matthew, what happens if our overseas supplier if there's sensitive information? We'll cover that off with MB next week around what is the minimum disclosure requirements. And so hopefully we'll get that question answered then. John, what happens if you fall under an alternative rather than acceptable solution when meeting performance standards? Again, a big topic. Just a succinct answer to that.
That's when you then need to think about developing a compliance pathway that and that's really getting a professional to assist you around, so working out a framework where how you can provide an evidence base for a product which is not specified in an alternative as an acceptable solution, which reference standards. Short answer to a big question.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. Longer conversation. Okay. We'll look at, and I think
yeah. So just more on that sort of, John, you know, it's useful sometimes, like these things, you know, the world is presented, and all the MB information presents the world as if it's a binary situation, acceptable solution, alternative solution. In fact, the real world is a spectrum in between the two. In many cases, many products have many of the attributes of a product which is an acceptable solution, and only some additional features which are outside that particular scope. So often the first step is to do a bit of a gap analysis around how far away your product is from a classic product set up an acceptable solution, and then look at how you can provide an evidential pathway to close that gap.
Yeah, and Johnny made a good point earlier around if we've got a tight scope of use, or that's really clear, that actually can work, be a real advantage for us as suppliers, to make sure it's really clear on where that product's intended to be used to avoid any misuse or misinstallation in the future. Right, Dan, link to the BPIR document. Does it need to be linked on every product on a website, or can a list of BPIR documents be on a landing page? Dan, my understanding is that if you have that clearly indexed within a landing page or on a product page, as long as that you can show evidence of navigation to be able to find that document, either as a solution. So I'd just make sure you've got some reference on the home page as to where that information can be found. Either of those will suffice. All right, keep going. If you manufacture and install your own product, it's not available for sale with third parties, would an installation manual still be required? John, do you have a view on that?
On the face of it, no. So no.
Okay, I'm sure it'll be required for those who do install it, if you've got approved installers, but not a requirement for general public or DIY. If we have a BIM library with the BPIR data have to be attached to the metadata and families, look, I think that's something, if you saw advantage, you could do that, but there's certainly no code requirement to have any links within families or design software or project folders to doing that, as long as it's available in general to public. Joel, can we get copies of the PowerPoint topics we've had on the screen, please? Yes, no one's actually asked for that before, but yes, we can make these slides available. John, a number of questions around can we edit within the BPIR Ready software? I think John's disclosed that no. The idea here is to draft it. You will then actually download it either as a PDF or cut and paste it into Word document, and you can then finalize the document there. You may actually, on conclusion, realize that some of the suggestions in BPIR Ready don't actually apply to your product, and that's completely up to you to determine what references you want to have, what level of evidence and documentation. So remember, the BPIR Ready tool is really just there to provide tips and guidance to help you develop it, but really it's up to you to be able to finalize and then publish it. Darren, are there any plumbing examples? All seem to be building products. Yes, we're a bit building product centric. We're keen to get feedback from you. We pass on MB that they can actually widen the level of exemplars that they put into the market. And I do think they need an example from the the plumbing industry. So I'd encourage you to fill out that feedback form and allow us to pass that on to MB, because we would certainly support that. Chris, can you show an example of products that fall under other? Chris, that's actually one of the, I suppose the big issues here is that, that we've got no real direction. You've got to prove whether you exclude or are included within the legislation. I'm hoping we might get some more guidance from MB over the next few months, but it really is a grey area. So it would be an exhaustive list for us to be able to do that. We're hoping MB can provide some more guidance there. All right. Type tests obtained for product certification, intellectual property, yes, serve no purpose to real customers. So I think in many cases, some testing is not suitable. You don't have to provide all testing information, but certainly a summary around the compliance is important. Often people will use third parties to be able to view sensitive information and then put together an opinion of that evidence. So there are ways in which you can actually deal with sensitive information, either using a third party or providing a summary. John Gardiner, have you got any further information you'd like to add to that?
Sorry, what one was that?
It was just around the type test. So, you know, some of that testing information can be quite sensitive.
Yes, yeah,
disclosed to public.
Yeah, and there is, and yeah, so I think personally, I think it's the judgment of the supplier to make a call as to what amount of their IP they need to publicly disclose or not.
Yes. All right, we've got a number of other questions here that I will get to, but I'm conscious of time. We're just about to conclude, so just would like to finish with what we can expect next week, and I can then come back to questions. If you'd like to hang on, you're more than welcome to. If you need to go, again, you can watch a recording of this at a later date. Okay. Great, I'm hoping you can see my screen here. So next week, we actually have MB who will be back with us. I believe it's going to be Lisa Clefane, who will be helping to answer some of the questions, particularly around these areas of inclusions and exclusions. They will then actually just cover off the minimum requirement for contact details, particularly for those of you who are importing products. We will then look to the final sections of the BPIR requirements. I know there was a question around installation requirements are not listed under the BPIR regulations. In fact, they do actually reference the fact that any specific information that relates to the performance requirements, which could include design requirements and installation, should be referenced. So we do think it's good practice to actually have that any installation information, if that does in fact add to the code requirements. But things like warnings and bans, titling, warranties and maintenance will be all in next week's session. And finally, what are the requirements for keeping them updated? So as you know, if we've got products that are obsolete, how long do we need to keep those documents available for? Can we just add new ranges to an existing BPIR document if we've got new versions that come into the market? So that'll be our third and final session, which will be next Tuesday at 1 o'clock. Just want to reiterate, you can use the same link that the Zoom link that you've been using for the last two sessions. That'll obviously work for session number 3. We always value your feedback, so you can do that by responding to our follow-up summary emails, and also using that feedback tool that Nancy put a link to at the beginning of the session. So that's actually kind of the close of today's session. But for those of you who need to go, thank you for your attendance today. I hope that was helpful. Nancy, do you mind? Actually, I can just quickly do this and put an exit poll up. Always keen to get your feedback. So please give us any comments there at all. John, we're just going to finish off some of the questions that we've got here in chat. Is there an independent body to help determine if a product is included or excluded BPIR requirements? John Gardiner.
No, I'm just thinking, no, there isn't. There's no framing. I think MB have indicated that you can go to them, but I'm not quite certain how the experience of that. I'm aware of the experience of some people who have gone to them to ask a question. They haven't got a particularly helpful answer back, but they weren't. So just not quite sure how it's going to play out. But the short answer is there's no clear mechanism for sorting that out at this stage.
Yes. Yep. Thank you. Wade, is it intended that BPIR documents replace EPDs in terms of embodied carbon? EPDs are quite a detailed document. That I could not see that happening, Wade. Yeah, an EPD is in some ways an exhaustive process to get through. Not only are you looking at the environmental requirements of the product, but it's also an audit of the supply chain for that as well. It needs to be annually reviewed. I think there's going to be lots of interesting developments within environmental assessment, particularly carbon, but EPDs certainly are they are the gold standard at the moment, and I wouldn't see that this legislation would replace that. It may well reference things like GWP, global warming potential, which is a key detail or data that comes out of EPDs, but I'd see those as remaining separate. A question, we manufacture complete garden shed kits and have a PS1. What do we need to do for December 11 of this year? John Gardiner, do you have a view on garden shed kits?
Then this is an interim view, because I was thinking about this the other day when I was looking at a gazebo that's gone into my mother's retirement village, in the same sort of category. I think there are some BPI requirements. That's for if it's a standalone thing, and probably there you might just want to put an overlay on the producer statement to be able to then, that looks a bit like the BPIR, and then use the producer statement you've got as part of your evidence base for that.
Great, thank you. Caroline, appreciate the MB don't want to commit to enforcement as from the 11th of December, but would appreciate knowing whether expectations are soft, particularly in relation to overseas suppliers. Caroline, the message I heard last week is that they're actually going to get into it straight away from the 11th of December. So I think they are committed to that and gearing up for it. So I would expect that when they're receiving complaints from 11th of December, they'll be following those up quickly and, you know, using their powers. So if that's something you want to reiterate with MB next week, then please let us know, and again we can get them to state their expectations. Rob, with regards to the format, MB provided a template to follow, list all the fields that are required. You have stated no format is required. It's like MB leaving it up to the industry to specify what clauses are applicable to a specific product. So yes, their template references all of the information which is required under the these regulations, but it can be in any order. And so they're suggesting that that's something you can use, but you can come up with your own template if it does disclose all of that information. So I hope that kind of clarifies that somewhat.
And if I could add something there, Matt, is also what you understand it. It doesn't. Not only does it have to be not in the same order, it can be in different documents. It can be distributed in different documents.
Okay. Simon, is there going to be a review of the building code reflect changes in technology with materials? Simon, that's outside the scope of this forum. John, I don't know if you're aware of any review of building code. Simon's referencing E2 here. I'm not aware of anything that's looking at E2.
No, can I just be a bit theoretical here? Insofar as in theory, the way with the performance-based building code, as I indicated before, it's neutral with respect to the type of products you are using, etc. That's the advantage of performance-based building code. But I think the point is quite valid insofar as the fact that we are reliant on having to look to acceptable solutions and verification methods for establishing compliance. As those things become less and less relevant to the building products in the marketplace, establishing compliance for those products which haven't got a basis and an acceptable solution becomes increasingly difficult.
Okay, thank you. All right, Caroline, just picking up on commercially sensitive information, query as to why is it necessary to provide contact details for overseas manufacturers if that doesn't relate to the usability of the product. Yes, Caroline, again, great question. We can bring that up again next week. Appreciate that. Certain information requested on the form, e.g. installation requirements, is available within other existing available documents, e.g. a technical or installation sheet. Can we just make reference on the form that the information is available within the other documents? Absolutely, you can. So I think John indicated that you may well want to reference that design, installation and warranties could actually be within your design guide or your product guide, or might even be a technical data sheet. So yes, you can absolutely do that. All right, can you send a list of consultants or a link to where we can find third-party businesses to assist with compliance? Yes, we actually have that on the BPIR Ready website. John Allen, do you mind just putting in a link there?
Yep, I'll put in a link. You can scroll to the bottom of any page as well, and it's down there in the footer.
Yes, okay, thank you. Our products form part of a cladding system and only specified as a system. When product X is applied as part of the system, if design used, installed, and applied in accordance with the statements and conditions of a brand's appraisal, sorry, Ben, I'm not sure if you're answering someone's question or if there is actually a question there. I would certainly think that if you have a system, then you'd be completing the BPIR requirements as a system, as you have done with your brand's appraisal. Andrew, cavity sliders fall under the BPIR requirements. John, do you have a quick view on that?
Well, my own view is no, but I'm not, and I'm just working through that because that cropped up last week around that, and I need to get back to a few people about that. But yes, yeah, my own professional view is that no, but that answer would appear to be slightly inconsistent with some of the things that we've heard from MB.
Right. Okay. Okay, and just a couple of final questions. Builders, developers are already asking us for a copy of our BPIR. Wow. Okay, well, this completely ignores the legislative reality of the BPIR, that it's a website and can then be links to different pages and documents. Well, look, that's impressive that you've already got the industry who are asking for this. I'm sure MB will be happy to hear that in some regard. But again, there's no legal requirement for it until the 11th of December. Might be an opportunity for you to be able to get that completed. Give it to the developer, because knowing that others in your category won't be as advanced, but certainly there's no legislative requirement until December. Finally, if we've produced a product that falls into both Class 1 and Class 2, can we produce one BPIR? Just trying to think of an example where that would happen, Brendan. There are different requirements for Class 2, where effectively you're looking at the manufacturer and I suppose reference a fabricator as well. Thank you, cladding to retail and custom builds.
Yeah,
so Brendan, what I assume there, John, if I can just clarify, he's obviously got, let's say, some boards that are available through a merchant, but they may also well have their own system, a cladding system that they could provide directly to a cladding installer.
Yeah, and further clarification. Yes.
What I would say to that, I think what we learned from MB, and John, just correct me here, is that if it's available through retail, you'll need a BPIR. If it's customized and specific to a project, to a building, no BPIR is required. We covered that off with benchtops last week with MB. Yeah. So if it's a specific design, no BPIR requirements. But obviously for those that are batch goods and available through retail, then there is. All right. Thank you for your feedback and questions today. I hope you found that valuable. Look forward to your attendance next week. Please give us some feedback and fill out that with the poll and the feedback form that we've got in the chat link there. John Gardiner, thanks again for your expertise and time today. Have a great week, everyone, and we'll see you next Tuesday for our final session. Many thanks.
Thanks, Matt.